This video was brought to you by Nebula. Last week, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán dramatically declared that the EU was on a path to self-destruction. We've heard this kind of rhetoric from Orbán before, but since taking the reins of the rotating EU Council presidency in July, Orbán seems to be trying to make the most out of being in the spotlight, dishing out more and more criticism of Europe while promoting his own vision of a new global world order with himself, Trump, Putin and Asia at the centre. So in this video, we'll take a look at what Orbán's been saying recently, what his plans for the EU are, and what it means when he says he wants to make Europe great again. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's start with some context about Orbán's relationship with the EU. Orbán's right-wing nationalist Fidesz party has clashed with Brussels on a range of issues since it came to power in 2010, notably over democratic rights, alleged corruption, and more recently, foreign policy. After the EU ruled that Hungary was no longer a full democracy in 2021, Orbán accused the bloc of Hungarophobia and even called for the dissolution of the European Parliament. At the end of last year, his government also submitted a bill to the European Parliament on protecting national sovereignty to defend against what it called undue political influence by foreign groups. And he's now established a new right-wing grouping in the European Parliament called Patriots for Europe, alongside Marine Le Pen's National Rally, which also wants to push for more nationalistic politics in Europe and has now become the Parliament's third biggest group. This all ties in with what's currently the biggest point of contention between Hungary and the EU, which are its foreign policy disagreements. Until early 2024, the main sticking point in the Hungary-EU relationship was the EU's withholding of 22 billion euros in structural funds earmarked for Hungary, due to concerns over corruption and the rule of law under Orbán. But since the bloc's decision to unfreeze the cash to appease Orbán and stop him from blocking EU military aid to Ukraine, the funding issue has been replaced by foreign policy clashes, with Orbán taking up positions that are increasingly at odds with those of the EU. Specifically, Orbán has pursued conspicuously cozy relations with Russia, China, and US Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. This isn't entirely new. Orbán has been currying favour with Putin for a while now, having repeatedly opposed sanctions against Russia since its annexation of Crimea in 2014. The same year he described Russia, along with China and Turkey, as the model state for Hungary. Then, just last month, Orbán deliberately went against the grain, kicking off his EU Council presidency with a self-declared peace mission to Kyiv, Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and Trump's residence in Mar-a-Lago. During the trip, Orbán met with Putin and claimed to be representing the European Union, which unsurprisingly sparked criticism from leaders within the bloc and the Council's legal service, which said that Orbán had breached Article 24.3 of the EU treaties, which states that all countries must support the bloc's foreign policy. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the rest of the EU, who duly announced a partial boycott of Hungary's EU Council presidency, saying that it would not send any of its 27 high-ranking commissioners to Hungary's meetings, instead allowing only civil servants to attend. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has also called for an alternative foreign affairs summit in Brussels to rival Orbán's meeting in Budapest at the end of summer, calling out Orbán's lack of loyal cooperation on foreign policy and saying his stop in Moscow will not bring peace. Nonetheless, this hasn't deterred Orbán, who's continued pledging to make Europe great again. So what does Orbán actually mean when he says this? Well, last week, Orbán made his annual appearance at the Tusványos Summer University platform in Bály-Tusnád, a majority ethnic Hungarian town in central Romania. Now, Orbán typically uses these speeches to shore up support for his base, signal the ideological direction of his Fidesz government, and deride his critics, including the EU. Now, this year was no different, but with a greater focus on the EU, and it gave us a good sense of what Orbán means when he talks about making Europe great again. First and foremost, Orbán wants the EU to stop supporting Ukraine. In the past 2.5 years, Orbán has frustrated the EU by refusing to provide Kyiv with weapons and ammunition to defend against Russian aggression. And in his speech, he suggested that Ukraine shouldn't become a member of NATO or the EU, saying Ukraine will revert to the position of a buffer state. This isn't just because Orbán doesn't think Ukraine needs saving, but also because he thinks the EU's apparently jingoistic policy on Ukraine is isolating it diplomatically, because the rest of the world wants peace. Secondly, Orbán wants the EU to ditch the US, or at least the Democrats, and instead pivot to Asia. Orbán claimed that China, India, Pakistan, and Indonesia were on track to become the, quote, dominant center of the world, and said that all Europe is doing today is following the US's pro-democrat foreign policy unconditionally, even at the cost of self-destruction. Essentially, Orbán was portraying the EU as simply a minion of the current US democratic government, and implied that its position will have to change if Trump enters the White House later this year. Orbán also used his speech to defend not just Trump's politics, saying that he could, quote, pull the American people back from a post-nationalist liberal state to a nation state, but also his character, claiming that Trump's critics want to put him in prison and take away his assets, and added that if that doesn't work, they want to kill him. Thirdly, Orbán talked about how he wants to change the EU internally. Broadly speaking, it seems like Orbán wants to do two things. Firstly, he wants the EU to shift right on social issues, especially LGBTQ+ issues and immigration, with Orbán saying the Western experience is that if there are more guests than owners, the house is no longer a home. Again, Orbán claimed that what he sees as the EU's extreme social liberalism was isolating it from the rest of the world, who are more socially conservative. Now, we hear this kind of thing a lot from Orbán, who sparked controversy in 2022 by railing against Europe becoming a mixed-race society. But secondly, he also wants the EU to shift power away from Brussels and towards individual nation-states. Orbán describes the EU and Western Europe as aspiring to a, quote, post-national politics, which he claims feels alien to Central Europe, where the nation-state is still the organizing principle of politics. So, will Orbán get his way on all of these issues? Well, in the past, it would have been tempting to dismiss this as provocative but fundamentally empty rhetoric, given how isolated Orbán has been in Brussels. However, the rest of Europe might have to take his ideas more seriously now that the Patriots Group is the third largest in Parliament. Now, you can keep diving deeper into this and other news stories over on Nebula, where the TLDR team curates the most important news videos from around the world, saving you from a deluge of bad news and helping you pay attention to what really matters. This means no more feeling out of touch. On Nebula News, the TLDR team act as your guide through the media landscape, sharing the news that we're paying attention to and helping you to find the stories that matter and avoid burnout. Now, if you don't know already, Nebula is a streaming service that we co-own with a bunch of your favorite creators. There, you can watch original content like Real Life Law's incredible series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances, before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, then you can click the link in the description to sign up now. And if you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. Plus, Nebula will know that you came from us, which really helps us out. We've got some great feedback from existing members on the Nebula News features, so I hope you enjoy the effort that we're putting into Nebula News.